I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
I am the fucking hardest hustler in the world. This is Savage Part 2. Don't tell me about shit. It's 2022 and I'm still a savage. Whatever I want, I get. Whatever I want, I fucking get.
Today, Friday, January 16th, is a very bad day for Sean Diddy Combs. Not because of a press conference, not because of a headline, but because Netflix quietly did something far more dangerous. Without a trailer, without promotion, without explanation. They released part 2 of Sean Combs, The Reckoning, and the way it arrived is the first warning sign. When a story this heavy drops without noise, it's usually not meant to entertain the public. It's meant to exist, to sit there, to be found by the people who already understand what it means. This didn't feel like a sequel. It felt like pressure being applied silently. Back in December, when the original documentary first dropped, most people thought they were watching the full story. 4 carefully structured episodes, the rise of an empire, the controversies, the investigations. Footage filmed just days before everything changed. It shook the industry. Statements slowed, names went quiet, conversations shifted overnight. But even then, something felt unfinished. Scenes cut too early, questions raised but never returned to. Names that appeared briefly, then disappeared without context, and 50 Cent never hid that fact. He kept saying what people saw was only a portion of what existed. That certain material couldn't be shown at the time, that there was more. Most viewers assumed that was talk, until now. Because part 2 doesn't reintroduce itself. It doesn't recap. It doesn't explain why it exists. It assumes you remember what happened in December. And more importantly, it assumes you remember what didn't happen. There's no hand-holding here, no attempt to catch up casual viewers. That alone tells you who this release is really for. This isn't aimed at people discovering the story for the first time. It's aimed at people who were there when certain moments happened and believed time would do the rest. What makes this chapter unsettling isn't what it says. It's what it refuses to say out loud. Instead of dramatic narration or direct claims, it slows everything down. It places moments next to each other and lets the tension sit. Clips that once felt isolated now feel connected. Conversations that seem harmless suddenly carry weight. Not because the documentary tells you they should, but because your memory starts filling in the gaps on its own. And the timing matters. This didn't drop during a quiet period. It arrived while legal pressure still lingers, while civil matters continue quietly, while people who once spoke confidently are choosing their words carefully or not speaking at all. Silence at this stage isn't neutral. It becomes part of the material. One of the biggest shifts you feel immediately is where the camera chooses to stay. There's far less focus on public moments. No red carpets, no award shows, no rehearsed interviews everyone's already seen. Instead, attention drifts toward the in-between spaces, after parties, planning moments, conversations just before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. The kinds of moments that usually get cut, not because they're explosive, but because they become revealing when placed in the wrong order. That's where this chapter gets its weight. It doesn't chase shock value. It builds pressure through proximity, the same faces appearing in the same rooms across different years. The same tone used in completely different situations. The same confidence, even as circumstances change. Repetition like that doesn't feel accidental, and repetition is how patterns begin to form. What's especially effective is how little explanation is offered. Long stretches pass without commentary. You're shown where people were, who else was present, and how often these configurations repeat. No conclusions are drawn on screen, but your brain starts doing that work anyway, because once you see events stacked together instead of spaced years apart, forgetting becomes difficult. Before we go deeper, pause for a moment and answer this honestly in the comments. If damaging footage exists and no one directly denies it, do you think silence is a coincidence or a strategy? And before we continue, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's get back to the story. There's also an emotional shift compared to the first documentary that's hard to ignore. The original release carried a sense of revelation. This one carries consequence. It feels colder, more restrained, almost resigned. Like the story has moved past outrage and entered the phase where reality settles quietly. That's when reputations stop reacting and start calcifying, because outrage burns fast. Records don't. Another detail that stands out is how little resistance this release has faced publicly. No aggressive attempts to shut it down. No loud legal counterattack. Just carefully worded statements insisting narratives are being misunderstood. That response raises its own question. If nothing here holds weight, why not confront it directly? Why allow implication to linger instead of closing the loop? This chapter doesn't accuse, it reframes. It shows how narratives were managed publicly versus privately. What was said on record, what was handled off camera, how often those two worlds never fully aligned. It doesn't claim deception, it highlights separation, and separation allows plausible deniability. By the time you're halfway through this part, you realize something important has shifted. You're no longer watching to learn what happens next. You're watching to observe how people respond now that the room knows it's being watched. And reactions, or the lack of them, start to say more than any clip ever could. This is where the documentary becomes dangerous, not to individuals, but to systems. Systems that rely on time to soften edges. Systems that expect attention to move on before connections fully form. That expectation isn't holding the way it used to, because viewers aren't reacting emotionally anymore. They're watching structurally, comparing, replaying, noticing how explanations stop just before they become specific. Nothing here feels rushed, and that's intentional. Rushing invites mistakes. Patience invites observation, and observation doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. By the end of this stretch, one thing becomes clear without ever being stated. This story no longer needs new material to stay alive. It's feeding on what already exists and on what still hasn't been addressed. Silence stops functioning as a shield. It starts functioning as data. And from this point on, every move will be read differently, not because anything new is proven, but because the pattern is no longer hidden by distance or time. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's where the real pressure begins. As this chapter continues, the story tightens in a way that feels deliberate. Not louder, not faster, just closer. The documentary stops moving forward in time and starts moving inward, toward the spaces where explanations usually live, but rarely stay. What begins to surface is how familiar everything feels once it's compressed. Statements you've heard before, clips you remember seeing years ago, moments that once passed without pause. Nothing new on the surface, yet everything feels different now, because those moments are no longer separated by time. They're stacked. That stacking changes how the mind works. When the same voices, the same environments, the same tones appear again and again, coincidence becomes harder to rely on. The documentary never says that out loud. It lets repetition do the work. Repetition is quiet, but it's relentless. This part also pulls away from anything designed for public consumption. You don't see the polished interviews meant to reassure. You don't see the moments crafted to be quoted. Instead, the camera lingers where control is usually assumed. The in-between, the planning stages, the casual remarks made when no one thought they'd be revisited. Those are the moments that age differently. You start noticing how often confidence appears before clarity, how answers feel complete until they're placed next to what came later, how early certainty gives way to careful phrasing once scrutiny increases. Not denial, adjustment. An adjustment tells you pressure is being felt. The documentary slows even more here, allowing silence to stretch just long enough to feel intentional. Not dramatic silence, familiar silence. The kind that once felt responsible, professional, controlled. Now, after everything that's been aligned, it feels chosen. This is where the idea of time changes. Time is no longer a buffer. It's evidence. Years that once softened memory now sharpen it when placed side by side. Questions that were postponed don't disappear. they resurface heavier. You begin to see how often engagement stopped just before clarity would be required, how explanations ended where timelines should have begun, how accountability was acknowledged broadly but never placed specifically. Nothing false, nothing provable, just incomplete, and incompleteness, when repeated, stops feeling accidental. It starts feeling like method. This section also reframes how responses are read, not by what is said, but by how consistently the same approach is used. A brief statement, a measured tone, a pause, then distance. Distance that allows interpretation to float without ever landing. That distance used to feel neutral. Now it feels strategic. The audience's role shifts again here. You're no longer consuming information. You're measuring behavior, watching how each move fits into a pattern that's already been revealed. Who grows vague? Who stays silent? Who avoids specifics? Who disappears entirely? Absence becomes information. The documentary never points that out. It trusts the viewer to notice. And once noticed, it changes how every future moment is read. This is where the pressure builds without noise. Not through accusation, but through continuity. Through how often the same language appears across different years. How the same posture is maintained regardless of circumstances. How restraint becomes the default response even when engagement would clarify things. Restraint looks responsible until you see how often it prevents resolution. By now, the viewer understands that the story isn't being kept alive by new revelations. It's being sustained by what remains unresolved. An unresolved history doesn't fade, it waits. The documentary leans into that waiting. It doesn't rush to the next point. It lets the discomfort settle. Because once recognition sets in, it doesn't need reinforcement. You start asking a different kind of question, not what happened, but why does this keep happening the same way? That question doesn't demand proof. It demands awareness. And awareness is harder to shake than doubt. This part ends with a quiet shift in perspective. The realization that what you're watching isn't a sequence of events. It's a structure revealing itself. A structure built on patience, distance, and the expectation that attention will eventually move on. But attention hasn't moved on. It has changed. It's slower now, steadier, less reactive, more observant. And that kind of attention doesn't burn out. It accumulates. From here on, every pause will feel deliberate. Every response will be compared. Every silence will carry weight it didn't before. Not because anything new was proven, but because the pattern has become impossible to ignore. As the story moves deeper, something subtle but permanent happens. The documentary stops feeling like it's revealing information and starts feeling like it's testing memory. Not what you were told, but what you accepted without question. Because now the focus isn't on what was said, it's on what stayed consistent. The same phrasing appears across different moments. The same careful tone shows up regardless of the situation. The same pauses arrive at the same pressure points. Once you notice that consistency, it becomes impossible to treat each moment as separate. This is where the documentary becomes uncomfortable in a quiet way. You begin to see how often clarity was delayed, not denied. How answers were framed broadly enough to sound complete, yet vague enough to avoid follow-up. How responsibility was acknowledged in theory, but never located in practice. Each instance on its own feels explainable. Together, they start forming a shape, and shapes imply design. What's striking here is how rarely anything had to be corrected publicly, not because there was nothing to correct, but because the system relied on something more effective than explanation. Time. Time allowed urgency to fade. Time allowed new headlines to replace old questions. Time created distance where alignment would have been uncomfortable. But the documentary removes that distance. By compressing years into minutes, it forces moments to coexist that were never meant to be seen together. An early statement sits beside a later silence. A confident interview echoes next to a carefully worded non-answer. Nothing is edited to accuse. It's edited to compare. Comparison does the damage words never could. This is also where the viewer starts to notice how often silence arrived right when specifics were needed. Not at random, not inconsistently, but predictably. Silence wasn't the absence of response. It was the response. And that realization lands slowly, then all at once. The documentary doesn't highlight confrontation. It highlights avoidance. Not avoidance as weakness, but avoidance as strategy. A strategy refined over time, proven to work, and repeated because it consistently reduced risk. You start recognizing how influence operates without ever raising its voice. How power doesn't need to deny anything if it can simply wait. How patience becomes a shield when accountability would require alignment between stories that don't match perfectly. The audience's role shifts again here. You're no longer evaluating events. You're evaluating patterns of behavior. Who speaks in generalities? Who avoids timelines? Who acknowledges concern but never consequence? Who becomes quieter as scrutiny becomes sharper? Absence becomes louder than presence. And once that clicks, every future moment is read through a different lens. A short statement feels intentional. A delayed response feels calculated. Silence feels chosen. This is where the documentary stops relying on content and starts relying on context. The context of how things were handled, repeatedly, predictably, successfully. The most unsettling part is realizing how normal this once felt, how often restraint was praised, how easily distance was mistaken for maturity, how silence was framed as dignity instead of deflection. But dignity doesn't leave questions open forever. This section doesn't end with a reveal, it ends with a realization that what you're watching isn't a series of unrelated incidents. It's a method that doesn't collapse under pressure, it adapts to it. And adaptation is the clearest sign that pressure is real. By the time this part closes, the viewer understands something without being told. The story doesn't need new footage to move forward anymore. It has enough material already, enough alignment, enough repetition. From here on, every response will be measured against this pattern. Every pause will feel deliberate. Every silence will carry weight. Not because anything new has been proven, but because nothing unresolved can hide behind time anymore. By this point, the documentary stops feeling like it's building towards something and starts feeling like it's already arrived. Not at an answer, but at a threshold. The place where patterns stop being theoretical and start being recognized instinctively. You're no longer trying to remember what happened when. Your mind has moved past dates, past headlines, past individual moments. What you're watching now is behavior under observation, and behavior changes when it knows it's being watched. One of the most revealing shifts here is how controlled everything suddenly feels. Not chaotic, not defensive. Controlled. Statements become shorter. Appearances become rarer. Language becomes safer. The closer scrutiny gets, the less specific responses become. That inversion is impossible to miss once you're looking for it. The documentary doesn't frame this as panic. It frames it as discipline. Because panic reacts, discipline waits. You begin noticing how carefully engagement is managed. Who speaks publicly? Who chooses silence? Who lets others speak on their behalf? Distance increases just enough to avoid creating new reference points. And reference points are dangerous when old ones are being re-examined. What stands out most is how little needs to be said for the tension to build. The documentary understands something critical. Once a pattern is visible, repetition alone keeps it alive. It doesn't need commentary. It doesn't need escalation. It just needs time to sit, and it lets time sit. This is where older material starts behaving differently. Interviews you've seen before feel altered. Not because the words changed, but because the context did. Confidence that once felt natural now feels rehearsed. Humor feels defensive. Certainty feels selective, not false. Selective. Selection is powerful because it controls the frame without controlling the facts, and that's where influence lives. The documentary also widens its lens here. It's no longer centered on one figure or one circle. It starts showing how environments protect themselves, how loyalty is rewarded, how proximity becomes insulation, how shared silence creates shared safety. No one is accused, nothing is declared. The structure speaks for itself. You begin to see how often crises were followed by recalibration rather than resolution, visibility when needed, absence when useful, statements that acknowledged emotion but avoided explanation. Over and over again, that repetition removes coincidence from the equation. This is the moment where the audience fully shifts from reaction to evaluation. You're not asking whether something is true. You're asking whether the response makes sense given everything you've already seen. And increasingly, it doesn't. The documentary leans into that dissonance. It allows scenes to end without closure, conversations to stop just before clarity. It doesn't fill the silence. It preserves it. Because silence, once contextualized, becomes information. You also start noticing who remains comfortable, who continues moving forward unaffected, who maintains access, platforms, partnerships. Comfort under scrutiny is its own signal, not guilt, not innocence, signal. This part of the story isn't about collapse. It's about exposure of mechanics, how narratives are stabilized, how attention is redirected, how uncertainty is managed without ever being resolved. The most unsettling realization comes quietly. That this approach didn't fail for years because it worked. Not by convincing everyone, but by convincing enough people to move on. But now moving on doesn't feel natural anymore because the audience has changed. It's slower, more deliberate, less reactive. And that kind of attention doesn't need constant stimulation. It needs consistency. And consistency is exactly what's on display. By the end of the stretch, something fundamental has shifted in how the story feels. It no longer feels like it belongs to the present moment. It feels like it belongs to history being reorganized in real time. And once history starts reorganizing itself, silence stops being neutral. It starts being noticed. From here on, nothing will land the same way again. Not because of what's coming next, but because of what's already been seen, aligned, and understood. The pressure isn't rising, it's settling in. This is the point where everything tightens. Not because a new clip appears, not because a name is suddenly spoken out loud, but because the logic holding everything apart finally collapses. Up until now, it was possible to believe these moments existed separately. Different years, different situations, different explanations. But once they're aligned, once they're seen without the buffer of time, that separation stops working. This is the turning point, because what becomes visible here isn't an event, it's a system. The documentary stops circling the edges and quietly centers on something most people miss the first time around. How often control was maintained not through action, but through delay. Delay in responding, delay in clarifying. Delay in closing loops that should have been closed, and delay only works when people forget. Here, forgetting isn't possible anymore. You begin to notice how consistently moments of pressure were followed by the same response pattern. Not denial, not engagement, management. A calibrated presence when necessary, followed by strategic absence. The same rhythm repeating across different eras. That rhythm becomes impossible to ignore. This is also where the story shifts from observation to consequence. Not legal consequence, narrative consequence. Because once a pattern is identified, every future move is judged against it. Silence no longer feels like restraint. Distance no longer feels like dignity. Patience no longer feels neutral. They start feeling intentional. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone of orchestrating anything specific. It does something more unsettling. It shows how predictable the responses become once pressure is applied. Predictability removes innocence from the equation of randomness. It introduces expectation. Expectation is dangerous. Because now, when a statement doesn't come, it's noticed. When clarification is avoided, it's logged. When engagement stops at the exact moment clarity would be required, it feels familiar. Too familiar. This is where the audience realizes the story isn't unfolding anymore. It's revealing itself backward. Past moments rearrange in your mind. Old interviews feel heavier. Casual remarks feel less casual. Confidence sounds rehearsed. Not because the words changed, because the frame did. What lands hardest here is the realization that no single moment needed to be explosive for this structure to exist. It was built quietly, maintained patiently, protected by time doing the work no explanation ever could. Until now. This part makes something irreversible clear. The audience is no longer reacting to information. They're auditing behavior, measuring consistency, comparing responses across years instead of moments. And once that shift happens, control becomes much harder to maintain because control depends on fragmentation, and fragmentation has just been removed. This is the moment where the story stops asking for belief. It doesn't need belief anymore. It has alignment, and alignment creates gravity. From here on, every move will feel heavier, every silence louder, every delay more noticeable, not because the documentary says so, but because the pattern has fully come into view. And once a pattern is seen clearly, it doesn't disappear again. After that realization settles in, the story doesn't rush forward. It slows down even more. And that slowdown is intentional because once a system is visible, the smallest movements start to matter. This is where the documentary begins watching reactions instead of history. Who speaks now? Who suddenly doesn't? Who stays present just enough to be seen, but never enough to be pinned down? Every choice feels calculated, not in a dramatic way, but in a practiced one. The kind of calculation that comes from years of knowing when to step forward and when to disappear. Nothing feels impulsive. Everything feels rehearsed, and rehearsal only exists when outcomes are anticipated. You start noticing how narratives subtly adjust. Language softens around certain details. Timelines blur where they were once sharp. Conversations drift toward emotion instead of facts. Sympathy replaces specificity. Complexity replaces clarity. None of this is accidental. The documentary doesn't frame these shifts as guilt or innocence. It frames them as response. Response to a changing environment where old strategies no longer land the way they used to. Where silence, once protective, now attracts attention. That change in atmosphere is critical because pressure doesn't always look like outrage. Sometimes it looks like restraint being reinterpreted, like patience losing its cover, like distance starting to feel defensive instead of dignified. This part shows how power behaves when it senses that time might no longer be enough. There's a noticeable tightening around who gets access, who gets proximity, who speaks on whose behalf. Layers appear, buffers increase, intermediaries become more visible. The structure thickens. Structures only thicken when they're being tested. You also start seeing how loyalty is activated. Familiar faces reappear. Public alignment is emphasized. Unity becomes a message, not spoken directly, but displayed. And displays are designed to reassure more than explain. Reassurance is useful when explanations would raise more questions. The documentary lets these moments play out without commentary. It doesn't need to interpret them, because once the pattern is understood, interpretation happens automatically. This is where the audience's role changes again. You're no longer just observing behavior. You're anticipating it. You start predicting responses before they happen. And when those predictions are confirmed, the sense of control shifts away from the narrative itself. Predictability is the opposite of authority. Authority surprises. Predictability reveals process. This section also highlights how little has to be said now. The story has momentum without movement. Every resurfaced clip feels heavier. Every old quote lands differently. Not because it's new, but because it's now part of a visible sequence. Sequence turns memory into evidence, and evidence doesn't argue. It accumulates. By this point, the documentary has done something quietly dangerous. It has removed the need for new revelations. The story sustains itself through recognition alone, through the audience seeing the same response patterns repeat under slightly different lighting. Nothing explodes here, and that's the point. Explosions distract. Consistency convinces. As this part closes, the pressure feels different than before. It's no longer rising, it's surrounding, not coming from one direction, but from everywhere at once. From memory, from comparison, from expectation. And once expectation exists, every future move becomes a test, not of truth, but of whether the system can keep holding its shape now that everyone can see it. At this stage, the story no longer feels like it's moving toward a conclusion. It feels like it has crossed into something more permanent, a phase where nothing needs to be announced anymore because everything is already being measured. What stands out now is how careful the silence has become. Not empty silence, structured silence. Silence that appears exactly where clarity would create consequences. You start noticing how rarely anything is fully addressed, how responses arrive just long enough to acknowledge awareness, then retreat before alignment is required. How distance becomes the final layer of protection when explanation would collapse too many versions of the story at once. This is where the documentary stops showing events and starts revealing posture. Posture under pressure. Who leans forward? Who leans back? Who lets time pass instead of engaging? Time used to be the safest ally. Time softened memory. Time diluted urgency. Time allowed uncomfortable questions to age out of relevance. But that advantage has shifted. Time is no longer erasing, it's stacking. Every year that passes without resolution doesn't quiet the story anymore. It deepens it. You feel that weight now in how even neutral actions are interpreted differently. A public appearance feels strategic. A delayed response feels intentional. A missing voice feels louder than a present one. The documentary doesn't suggest panic. It suggests recalibration. Because when power senses that its old methods are being recognized, it doesn't collapse. It refines. It becomes quieter, more indirect, more patient. The goal isn't to convince, it's to outlast. But outlasting only works when attention moves on. And attention hasn't moved on. It has matured. The audience watching now isn't waiting for a shocking moment. They're waiting for consistency to break, for someone to say something that doesn't fit the pattern, for an action that creates alignment instead of distance. And that moment doesn't come, which becomes the point. By the end, you're left with a realization that doesn't need narration, that this story isn't being driven by what's revealed, but by what remains unanswered. That the most powerful element isn't footage or recordings or images. It's continuity. Continuity of behavior, continuity of response, continuity of avoidance. Once continuity is visible, it becomes impossible to dismiss. Because coincidence can be argued, patterns cannot. This is why the documentary feels heavier now than it did at the start. Not because it's louder, not because it's more aggressive, but because it has removed every place the story used to hide. There's no outrage here, no final accusation, no dramatic closing statement, just a quiet understanding that the narrative no longer belongs to the people trying to manage it. It belongs to memory, to comparison, to context. And once a story reaches that stage, it doesn't end. It waits. It observes. It gathers weight without making noise. That's the shift, not a reveal. A reckoning that doesn't need to announce itself anymore. By now, the story has reached a place where nothing needs to escalate for the tension to keep growing. The weight is already there. It's sitting in what hasn't happened, in what still hasn't been addressed, and in how carefully everything is being handled now. This is where the documentary feels less like a film and more like a mirror. Every old moment reflects differently. Every past statement sounds altered, not because the words changed, but because the audience has. What once felt reassuring now feels incomplete. What once sounded confident now feels controlled. What once passed as maturity now feels like avoidance. And avoidance, once recognized, changes everything. You begin to understand that this story was never meant to end cleanly. It wasn't designed for closure. It was designed for endurance, to stretch time, to survive cycles, to let attention burn itself out. But that design depends on one thing: people moving on. And that hasn't happened. Instead, people are watching more carefully than ever. Not emotionally, structurally. They're comparing timelines, replaying interviews, noticing how often answers stop just before they become useful, how often accountability is referenced without ever being placed. The documentary doesn't highlight this with arrows or captions. It doesn't need to. The repetition speaks clearly enough. This is also where the idea of legacy quietly enters the frame. Not legacy as achievement, but legacy as pattern. What gets repeated? What gets protected? What gets passed down as normal behavior in powerful spaces? Silence isn't just personal here, it's cultural. You start seeing how entire environments learn the same responses, how proximity to influence teaches restraint, how distance becomes a survival skill, how speaking less is rewarded more than speaking clearly. That realization is uncomfortable because it expands the story beyond individuals. It shows how systems preserve themselves even when individual moments come under scrutiny. And systems don't react the way people do. They adjust. That adjustment is happening now. You can feel it in how narratives soften, how language becomes more abstract, how conversations shift away from specifics toward general values, intentions, misunderstandings. Anything that feels safe enough to say without creating a record that can be revisited later. Records are dangerous because records allow comparison. And comparison is what has changed the entire shape of the story. By now, the audience isn't asking for proof. They're asking for coherence, for alignment between what was said then and what's being done now. And that alignment never fully arrives, which becomes the loudest statement of all. The documentary doesn't close doors here. It leaves them open deliberately. It lets unanswered questions breathe, because unanswered questions don't resolve themselves. They stay active. They stay alive. And as long as they stay alive, the story doesn't belong to those trying to control it anymore. It belongs to time, memory, and repetition. This is where the tension stops feeling temporary. It feels structural, embedded, like something that won't disappear with the next headline or the next project or the next carefully crafted statement. Nothing explodes here. Nothing needs to. The pressure has already done its work. And once pressure reaches this stage, it doesn't release. It holds, quietly, persistently, waiting for the moment when avoidance can no longer pass as restraint and silence can no longer pretend to be the end of the conversation. That moment hasn't arrived yet, but it's closer than it's ever been. At this stage, something subtle but irreversible has already happened. The audience isn't waiting for new footage anymore. They're watching behavior. They're watching timing. They're watching who moves quickly and who suddenly needs distance, who keeps speaking and who retreats into carefully chosen silence. And most importantly, they're watching how the story is being handled now that it's clear it isn't going away. This is where power usually relies on fatigue, on the assumption that attention will drift, that curiosity will soften, that people will eventually decide they've heard enough. But that assumption isn't holding, because the way this documentary unfolds has trained viewers to do something different. Instead of reacting, they're logging. Instead of debating, they're remembering. Instead of asking what's next, they're asking why the past keeps lining up the same way. That shift is dangerous, not because of what it proves, but because of what it exposes about strategy. You start to see how often narratives pivot away from specifics at the exact moment specificity would create clarity, how explanations expand outward but never downward, how language stays broad enough to sound responsive while remaining just vague enough to avoid commitment. Nothing here feels accidental anymore. And that's the point where perception hardens. Once perception hardens, statements lose power, denials lose urgency, clarifications feel late instead of reassuring, because the audience isn't listening for answers anymore. They're listening for consistency, and consistency has become the problem. The documentary doesn't accuse anyone directly. It doesn't need to. It allows patterns to speak for themselves. And patterns don't argue. They repeat. This is where silence becomes the most revealing element in the entire story. Not silence as absence of sound, but silence as choice. A choice to delay, a choice to generalize, a choice to wait instead of engage. For years, that choice worked. It allowed time to soften edges and space out uncomfortable moments. But now those moments are compressed, viewed together, compared side by side. Time is no longer a buffer, it's evidence of repetition. Viewers begin to notice how often similar situations produced similar responses across completely different eras. How tone remains controlled even when circumstances escalate. How the same emotional distance appears again and again, regardless of context. That doesn't feel like coincidence. It feels like design. And once design is recognized, everything shifts. The documentary becomes less about revelation and more about accountability without accusation. It doesn't say, this is what happened. It says, this is how things have been handled. That distinction matters because handling is a choice. Handling implies intention, and intention invites scrutiny. By now, the audience isn't emotionally charged. They're calm, focused, observant. And that's the most uncomfortable audience for any powerful system to face. Calm audiences don't burn out. They don't move on quickly. They don't need new drama to stay engaged. They stay because they're tracking continuity. The documentary understands this and leans into it. It slows the pace even further. It allows moments to breathe. It lets silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to settle in. You begin to feel the weight not of what's shown, but of what isn't being addressed. That weight doesn't scream, it presses. And pressure like that doesn't need a climax to be effective. It just needs time. The closer the story moves to the present, the more visible the adjustments become. Language shifts. Appearances are recalculated. Proximity is reassessed. Everyone seems to understand that how they move now will be interpreted through everything that came before. That awareness changes behavior, and behavior under observation is always revealing. This is where the audience realizes something quietly unsettling. The story doesn't need closure to have consequences. It doesn't need a final statement or a dramatic ending. It only needs memory. Memory that keeps comparing. Memory that keeps noticing. Memory that doesn't reset when a new project launches or a new narrative is introduced. At this point, the documentary has already done what it set out to do. It has removed isolation. Moments no longer exist alone. Statements no longer float without context. Silence no longer feels neutral. Everything is connected now. And once that connection is seen, it can't be undone. This is the phase where the story stops unfolding and starts holding. Holding pressure, holding attention, holding space, waiting for the moment when distance no longer feels safe and engagement becomes unavoidable. That moment hasn't arrived yet, but the room is quieter than it's ever been. And when a room goes quiet like this, it's not because nothing is happening. It's because everyone understands something is coming. By the time the story reaches this point, the question is no longer about footage or leaks or even documentaries. It's about control. Not control in the loud, obvious sense, but control over narrative, memory, and timing. Control over when a story is allowed to breathe and when it's supposed to disappear. Because what this entire rollout has quietly revealed is that power doesn't panic when it's challenged. It recalibrates. It gets quieter. It waits. And that's exactly what makes this moment different from every cycle before it. For years, the formula worked. A controversy surfaced. Attention spiked. A response appeared. Measured, careful, incomplete. Then time stepped in and smoothed the edges. The public moved on. The system stayed intact. But this time isn't doing what it used to do. Instead of erasing, it's stacking. Old interviews resurface and land differently. Old statements feel heavier. Casual jokes from years ago now sit under a harsher light. Not because new facts were added, but because context finally caught up. That's the shift no statement can undo. The documentary understands this, and that's why it doesn't chase a dramatic ending. There's no final reveal meant to shock you. No single clip designed to go viral on its own, because explosions fade. Patterns don't. Patterns settle in slowly. They linger. They stay with you long after the screen goes dark. By now, viewers aren't asking whether something is true or false. They're asking why the same responses keep appearing in different decades. Why the same language shows up in unrelated situations. Why silence always arrives at the same moment clarity would have forced alignment. Those questions don't require answers to be effective. They only require repetition, and repetition is everywhere. You begin to notice how narratives were never denied outright, just redirected. How responsibility was acknowledged in theory, but never placed in practice. How accountability was discussed broadly, while specifics remained just out of reach. Nothing provable, nothing deniable, just incomplete. And incompleteness, when repeated long enough, becomes a method. That's the uncomfortable realization this story leaves behind. Not that something shocking happened once, but that something familiar happened over and over. The documentary slowly pulls the lens back from individuals and focuses on the ecosystem around them. The friends who stayed quiet, the partners who kept doing business, the platforms that softened questions instead of sharpening them, the structures that absorb pressure without ever cracking. Because one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about protecting an image. It was about preserving a system. When criticism grew louder, attention was redirected. When scrutiny appeared, layers were added. When narratives became risky, distance was created. Not to erase the past, but to manage how it would be remembered. That's why moments of crisis were so often followed by strategic visibility, carefully timed appearances, controlled statements, content meant to remind the public who someone was supposed to be, not who they were beginning to question. And when family entered the picture, that strategy intensified. Unity became proof. Loyalty became shield. Criticism was reframed as attack instead of inquiry. For a long time that worked. But what changes here is the audience. They're no longer reacting emotionally. They're observing structurally, measuring tone, measuring timing, measuring what's said and what's avoided. Silence at this stage stops feeling like restraint. It feels like choice, a choice that keeps repeating itself. And once a choice is visible, it can't hide behind time anymore. This is why the story doesn't end with a documentary. It enters a different phase, a phase where every past decision is reread, every relationship is re-examined, every moment of silence is weighed against everything that came before it, not loudly, quietly. That's the part many people underestimate. Quiet scrutiny doesn't burn out. It doesn't need outrage to survive. It feeds on memory, and memory doesn't reset just because a new project launches or a new narrative is introduced. By the final moments, the takeaway isn't anger, it's clarity. Clarity about how power operates, how systems protect themselves, how influence passes down quietly, how environments shape behavior long before cameras arrive, and how truth rarely shows up all at once. It leaks, piece by piece, until ignoring it becomes harder than facing it. That's why this story feels unfinished. Not because more footage is coming, but because the questions have finally stabilized. They're no longer scattered. They're no longer noisy. They're steady. And steady questions are the hardest ones to outrun. If you've stayed till this moment, you already understand this was never just about one name, one documentary, or one release. It's about how narratives are built, maintained, and eventually tested. And now that the testing has begun, time is no longer on anyone's side. If you want to stay ahead of where this goes next, before it's rewritten, reframed, or buried again, make sure you're subscribed, drop your thoughts below, and stay locked in. Because this chapter may be closing, but the consequences are just beginning. By now, the most revealing part of this entire situation isn't what's being shown. It's what people are choosing to do now that it's been shown. Because once a story reaches this stage, everything becomes a response. Every appearance, every delay, every carefully chosen word, even the decision to say nothing at all. Silence stops being empty. It becomes intentional. And intention is what the audience is reading. What's happening here isn't collapse. It's exposure of a playbook, a long-used method that relied on one assumption above all others, that time would eventually soften memory. That assumption no longer holds. The audience isn't forgetting. They're revisiting, rewatching, recontextualizing. Clips that once felt harmless now carry weight. Statements that once sounded confident now feel incomplete. Distance that once looked mature now feels strategic. And strategy once seen can't be unseen. That's why this phase feels different from every controversy before it. There's no rush to outrage, no hunger for spectacle, just a quiet, sustained attention that refuses to move on. This kind of attention is dangerous because it doesn't burn out. It doesn't need new material. It feeds on what already exists. Every old interview that resurfaces becomes part of the record. Every past denial is weighed against current silence. Every gap becomes more noticeable the longer it remains unaddressed. At this point, explanations don't need to be challenged. They need to be completed. And that's where the tension lives. Completion creates accountability. Accountability creates alignment. And alignment forces stories that were once kept separate to exist side by side. That's what this documentary has done more effectively than anything before it. It removed isolation. Moments are no longer protected by distance. Timelines are no longer blurred by years. Everything now exists in the same frame. When that happens, coincidence starts to look like continuity. And continuity raises questions that statements can't dissolve. You begin to see how often influence insulated consequences, how proximity muted scrutiny, how reputation filled in gaps where clarity never arrived. None of this needs to be shouted. It's already loud in its consistency. The most uncomfortable realization for many viewers is that nothing here feels chaotic. It feels orderly, managed, repeated with precision across decades. That kind of order doesn't happen accidentally. It's learned, modeled, refined, and once it's recognized, it changes how every past moment is interpreted. That's why reactions matter more than revelations now. The way people move under observation tells you more than any archive ever could. Some lean into visibility. Others create distance. Some speak broadly. Others retreat into generalities. Not because they're confused, but because clarity creates reference points, and reference points invite comparison. Comparison is the real threat. The documentary doesn't chase that threat directly. It simply lets time collapse. It lets moments coexist. It lets the audience do the math, and the audience is doing it, quietly, relentlessly. At this stage, the story no longer belongs to filmmakers, platforms, or headlines. It belongs to memory. Memory that doesn't reset. Memory that keeps stacking. Memory that turns silence into signal. This is where the long game begins to fail, because the long game depends on patience turning into apathy. And that's not happening here. Instead, patience has turned into scrutiny. And scrutiny doesn't need an ending to be effective. It just needs consistency. By now, viewers aren't asking what will be revealed next. They're watching how the present reacts to the past, and every move is being read through that lens. That's the pressure that doesn't ease with time. It intensifies, slowly, invisibly, until the space for avoidance disappears. This is no longer a moment, it's a process. And processes don't end cleanly. They conclude when engagement becomes unavoidable. That moment hasn't arrived yet, but the room is holding its breath. And when a room holds its breath this long, it's not waiting for noise. It's waiting for truth to decide how it wants to arrive. At the very end of this story, something becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing exploded. Nothing collapsed overnight. No single moment arrived that neatly wrapped everything up. And that's exactly why this ending matters more than any dramatic reveal ever could. Because real power doesn't fall loudly. It erodes quietly. What this entire journey has done is expose how erosion begins, not through scandal alone, but through accumulation, through memory refusing to reset, through patterns refusing to scatter, through silence losing its protective effect. By now, the audience isn't waiting for confirmation. They're waiting for alignment. Alignment between past statements and present behavior. Alignment between image and response. Alignment between what was said years ago and what is avoided now. And the longer that alignment doesn't arrive, the louder the absence becomes. This is where narratives usually rely on distraction, a new headline, a new controversy, a new cycle to pull attention elsewhere. But something has shifted. Attention isn't chasing anymore. It's standing still, watching, measuring. You can feel it in how carefully everything is being handled now. How language is filtered, how appearances are calculated, how distance is maintained even when engagement would seem natural. That level of caution doesn't come from confidence. It comes from awareness. Awareness that the audience has changed. They aren't asking who to believe. They're asking why the same methods keep appearing across different eras. Why silence shows up at the same pressure points. Why explanations always stop just short of clarity. Those questions don't need answers to do damage. They only need repetition. And repetition has already done its work. At this point, the story no longer belongs to the people who once guided it. It belongs to the timeline itself, to memory stitched together without gaps, to moments that can no longer hide behind distance or context. That's why this feels heavier than anything before it. Not because of outrage, but because of recognition. Recognition that what once felt isolated now feels intentional. That what once felt handled now feels suspended. That what once felt finished is very clearly not. This isn't about proving something. It's about understanding something. Understanding how influence moves quietly. How systems protect themselves without ever saying they need protection. How time was used not to heal, but to delay. and how delay only works until people stop forgetting. That's the point we've reached. From here on, every new statement will be compared. Every silence will be noticed. Every attempt to redirect will be measured against everything that came before it, not emotionally, structurally. And structure doesn't respond to noise. It responds to consistency. That's why this ending doesn't offer closure, because closure would imply resolution, and resolution hasn't happened. What has happened is something far more permanent. The questions have settled. They're no longer scattered across headlines or buried in old interviews. They're steady, central, impossible to outrun. This is the phase where stories don't disappear. They wait. They apply pressure without movement. They sit in the background of every future decision. And once a story reaches that stage, it no longer needs to be told again. It simply needs to be remembered. That's where this ends, not with a reveal, not with a verdict, but with a shift in how everything that follows will be seen. Because when memory becomes organized, silence loses its power. And when silence loses its power, the next move matters more than all the ones that came before it. This chapter closes quietly, but what it leaves behind isn't quiet at all.